Camp Cringe, streaming on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
The school bus arrives at Camp Sawiki Wiki for its annual summer camp.
What the hell is your problem, lady? Do you need something, or are you just trying to ruin my vibe?
My name is Tony. Are you hurt?
You kids shouldn't be out here playing with fire.
Does anyone else see that creepy lady following Nevea? Or is it just me?
Yo, what is that noise?
Remember, God is watching.
Welcome to Camp Cringe, man. We're so screwed.
New episodes every 25th of the month.
The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
I was getting close to breaking him when we were doing the interview. If you didn't do anything wrong, your natural instinct is, hey, whoa, I was just driving down the street. I looked over a bridge. I didn't do anything. I don't even know what you're talking about. I'm just trying to do the right thing. I called you guys. What's going on here? You know? And even if you do have that, I'm not going to give you my blood. I don't know what you guys are trying to do. But he never really looked at me and said, I didn't kill her. Mike Petrie, lead detective, Dearborn Heights Police Department. From The Baby Doll Serial Killer, The John Eric Armstrong Homicides by R.B. Bates and Gerald Cliff, Ph.D. Well, welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club. I am your host, Jill. I want to wish you a slightly early happy Valentine's Day, and I hope you have survived the polar vortex. Boy, that was chilly. Now, before we jump into our true crime book today, I'd like to send a shout out to thank Curly Toad Shoes and AP Gifts for your support for my podcast on YouTube, and also Jewid Wu and Depot 83, and my new Patreon members, Marie, Sheila, and Tommy89. I really do appreciate you. I see you as you hear me. Thank you for helping me choose our books and for your input and insight. As always, I don't really want to do this without you. Okay, this is episode 113, The Contortionist, part 1 of The Baby Doll Serial Killer, The John Eric Armstrong Homicides by B.R. Bates and Gerald Cliff. I am delighted to bring you this book on a case I had never heard about before. How is it possible that I don't know a serial killer case? Well, this book recently hit my murder shelf. It was published in late October of 2024, and it is out to rave reviews, mine included. Comes in at 422 pages, and each is chocked with information, data, research, evidence, first-hand accounts. Anyway, it is astonishing. So you can get the book on Amazon or anywhere else you want to buy your books. But I do have a link on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, February 2025. Now, heads up, there are some really difficult subject matter that comes up in this story. And I mean, it's a serial killer story, so you kind of expect that. But I just wanted to give you a little heads up. So a bit about our authors. B.R. Bates is a longtime journalist, the author of 10 books and other publications. B.R. Bates graduated with her bachelor's degree in journalism from Michigan State University and spent 10 years in the daily newspaper industry before transitioning to the corporate world. She spent 5 years at the Detroit News, where she worked at the time of the Armstrong case. A Michigan native, Bates has also lived in Atlanta and Washington, D.C. Now, Detroit Police Department's Gerald Cliff was the commanding officer of the Violent Crime Section and task force that investigated the Armstrong case right from day one. Dr. Cliff has degrees in criminal justice from Michigan State University and the University of Detroit, and advanced degrees in public administration and urban politics from Wayne State University. And I want to highlight this because law enforcement is criticized and on occasion have dropped the ball, and I have covered these kinds of cases. But I also want to spell it out when police agencies excel. During this investigation, Gerald Cliff juggled a large number of law enforcement agencies, from local to federal, working together to see justice for the victims and their families. The Detroit Violent Crime Section is composed of the cream of the crop investigators with a wealth of experience, having cut their collective teeth in one of the most violent cities of the United States at the time. Jerry Cliff tells us of, quote, talented detectives, good supervision, and inspirational leadership, end quote, all headed by a truly terrific and devoted Chief of Police, Benny Napoleon. But this is a true crime book club, and it is our first episode, so I have some decadent deliciousness for you. A specialty from Detroit, bumpy cake. All right, if you like chocolate, you must try this. I want to thank Alexandra Penfold for her recipe, found on SeriousEats.com, September 2023. Now, this is a complicated recipe, and it is not left for the night before book club. But I promise you, this is incredible. So find the recipe on my blog and look it over for yourself. It involves cocoa powder, butter, sugar, vanilla, buttercream, and chocolate frosting. There is a lot of mixing and chilling for each step, plus the baking. The big tip in making this is being sure to chill in between the steps. And listen, I even bought buttercream and I didn't make it from scratch, and it was still delicious. One of these days I will make the buttercream myself. So I did cheat. I do like easy, and this is complicated. Either way, it is a really wonderful, wonderful, delicious dessert. So check out the Detroit Bumpy Cake recipe. And our wine to match this delicious chocolatey cake is Copper Point Merlot from 2023 as well, from the Lathwaites Wine Club. Copper Point Merlot 2023 is from Lodi, California. It is a full-bodied red, lush, with bursting plum and strawberry, with a hint of oaky spice teasing your palate. It has a wonderful, velvety texture on the finish. This wine is a gorgeous ruby red in color, and where the plum aroma just makes each sip magic. I purchased this via Lathwaites Wine Club, where it cost $18.99. Now, this is a new club that I've joined, and I have to tell you that I love it. Well, anyway, sip and swirl, murder bookies. Now, into our story, which revolves around tragic, senseless homicides of very vulnerable women and those who are sucked into the maelstrom, which begins around December 2nd, 1999. That night was dark with a temperature of about 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius, which is relatively warm for Michigan in December. Monica Johnson, a 31-year-old Black woman with black hair featuring red highlights, was walking along Michigan Avenue in a rough neighborhood trying to make some money. Monica was the mother of 4 children, aged 10, 8, 7, and 3. Their grandmother, Monica's mother, was worried about her daughter. Raised on the east side of Detroit, Monica and her siblings attended Kettering High School. Well, that night in December, Monica's boyfriend, Cliff, was waiting for her in the car, but fell asleep. When he woke up around 4 a.m. and realized she hadn't returned and she hadn't called, he decided to go home. Cliff would never see Monica again. R.B. Bates would later reach out to each of Monica's siblings. Some of the conversations were politely declined, while others were filled with pain and the trauma of loss. Monica had deeply loved her family and held a special place in their hearts. She was a hard worker who had worked at banks, fast food restaurants, and even a watch company. The circumstances that led her to be on Michigan Avenue, working as a sex worker, were all sadly too common, involving drug addiction and a desperate need for money. Little did she know that a killer had just relocated his family to the Detroit area a few months earlier, and this would mark his first murder in Detroit. Now, Detroit, Michigan is the largest U.S. port city along the Canadian border. In 1996, Detroit had approved casino gambling, with temporary casinos opening in 1999. Historic U.S. Highway 12, known as Michigan Avenue by the locals, intersected several other highways. In 1999, churches, gas stations, liquor stores, used car lots, and old bank buildings dotted the roadway, with commerce happening around the old Tiger Stadium and the once grand Michigan Central Train Depot. Suburbs like Dearborn and Dearborn Heights have strip malls, hair salons, doctor and dentist practices, being somewhat more civilized. Yet Detroit has the seedier side, with strip clubs and prostitution, from Michigan Avenue to the infamous Cass Corridor. And here it was on Michigan Avenue around 11 p.m. that the killer first saw Monica Johnson. He described her as having a medium complexion, being 120 pounds or 54 kilos, wearing orange pants and a black vinyl jacket. Seeing this guy, Monica would have thought he was a typical white boy from the suburbs, innocent looking, wearing wire-rimmed glasses with red hair. Driving a newer 1998 Jeep Wrangler, dark bluish or gray, Monica jumped inside. After negotiating price, he paid her, driving to a secluded alley. He would later say, quote, "After we had sex, for some reason I started strangling her. I don't know why," end quote. This killer was 6'2" and 230 pounds. So think 1.9 meters and 105 kilograms. So this is a big guy. And Monica likely hadn't had a chance. After she stopped breathing, he left her face down on the sidewalk and drove away. He went home and took a shower. But Monica wasn't dead when the killer drove away. A man named Alan was driving home, and his head swiveled around. Wait, was that a woman laying in the street? He called 911, waiting for help to arrive. The police and the ambulance got there about 4 a.m., but failed to resuscitate her. The time of Monica's death was put at 5 a.m. With no ID, unknown female number 72 went in the autopsy report, with Dr. Carl J. Schmidt, the deputy chief medical examiner, determining that she had been strangled. The telltale petechiae, the tiny hemorrhages present around her eyes, and the hyoid bone fractured in her neck. Her fingerprints would finally reveal her name, and her broken-hearted mother was asked to come in and identify her daughter's body, with the whole family grief-stricken. Monica's 2 sons and 2 daughters would be raised by their grandparents. Decades later, her eldest son is doing well, a college graduate. However, his brother is serving time in prison. The girls grew up without a mom, and this would prove to be an all too familiar story. And the killer was just getting started. Wendy Jordan was turning 40 years old in a few months. Her family loved her dearly and insisted she did not belong working the streets. The oldest of 5 sisters and a brother, the family grew up on the east side of Detroit. Bonnie and Wendy were a year apart in age and were very close. After their mom died, Dad raised all of the kids with his sister's support. Wendy was kind and caring, and she'd give you the shirt off her back. In high school, Sister Bonnie recalls Wendy drifting towards street life, as she called it, wanting to party and smoke pot. After graduating high school in 1978, Wendy would move to New York City, staying with her Aunt Carol. She became an executive secretary, but was exposed to some vices as well as traumas. She returned home But the family saw that Wendy had a drug problem. Even so, she held good jobs over the years, but the drugs kept drawing her back to street life, resulting in a couple arrests, with her sister Judy raising Wendy's children. After missing for 3 years, a stranger's phone call would reunite the sisters, who were horrified to see Wendy was nothing but skin and bones. After rehab, Wendy rallied, fighting the urge, urgently desiring a better life. But it didn't stick. And Bonnie just did not understand it. Their father had a good job. They grew up with canopy beds. How could Wendy be sleeping in abandoned buildings? B.R. Bates points out that addiction is at the center of these women's stories. In the 1990s, the drug of choice was crack, and more recently it is heroin. But either way, these drugs make women turn away from their children. Well, my advice is just do not go there. It is not worth it. Truly, it's not. The last time they saw Wendy was New Year's Eve, and Bonnie knew something was wrong when Wendy did not call on New Year's Day 2000. The killer had just left work, second shift, about 10:45 p.m., heading out cruising the area. A gas station employee reported seeing Wendy about 4:30 a.m. that morning. Well, at some point after that, the killer picked up Wendy Jordan, negotiating payment for straight sex. Parking by a funeral home, they had sex, with him wrapping his hands around her throat, strangling her. Driving to a bridge, he would dump her body into the Rouge River below. He drove home and took a shower, going to bed. Murder bookies, you know how we hear that killers insert themselves into an investigation? Well, here you're seeing it happen. The next day, the killer would report sighting a body in the icy river in Dearborn Heights. Later, asked by the police, quote, "How did you feel when you threw her over the bridge?" Guilty, sorry, angry, end quote, replied the killer. The next afternoon, January 2nd, 2000, just as Bonnie Jordan was worrying about Wendy not calling, she received a phone call from the Dearborn Heights Police Department. Fingerprints from a newly murdered victim matched Wendy's. Shocked, the Jordan sisters went to identify their sister's body by photo and then at the morgue, and they fell apart as the reality of losing Wendy set in. Dr. Schmidt performed Wendy's autopsy, ruling her death a homicide by manual strangulation. Her toxicology screen was negative for alcohol and cocaine, but positive for opioids and morphine, indicating heroin use. And as bad as losing and having to identify Wendy, the Jordan family encountered a tragic mix-up. Wendy's body was embalmed at one location and later cremated at another, leaving the family without remains. Bonnie remains understandably furious about this situation. Now, Detroit funeral homes have faced significant issues in recent years, including the discovery of 63 fetuses in freezers in 2018 and the remains of at least 250 people in another facility in 2019. In 2022, Michigan suspended the license of another mortuary chain for misconduct. But despite these hardships, Wendy's memory lives through her sisters, who display her photographs at home and share stories about her with her granddaughter. Detroit victim number 3. Rose Marie Felt was born October 1967 to a military family in Hawaii and faced many challenges growing up. After her parents divorced, she moved to Tennessee with her mother and stepfather, where issues with alcohol and drugs plagued the family. Eventually, they would settle in southwest Detroit. While attending Western International High School, Rose, who was almost 16, fell in love with Alex, who was 5 years older. After getting permission from her mother to date, they would move in together and had a daughter named Jennifer in 1983. To support his family, Alex would work in the HVAC industry, but also dealt cocaine, which introduced Rose to drugs. After surviving an overdose, Alex took Rose and Jennifer to Disney World, providing a brief moment of normalcy in Rose's life. It was beautiful, and they avoided drugs during the trip, with Rose clean. But eventually, she fell back into substance use. Alex was then sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, and during this time, he and Rose did not see each other. Now, Rose was working as a waitress, struggling due to her lack of a high school diploma. She eventually gave custody of Jennifer to Alex's mom, signing the legal consent papers. As Rose became more involved in drugs and prostitution, Alex would move on to a new relationship, but always allowed Rose to see Jennifer. He spoke kindly of Rose, noting, quote, "The addiction led her down this path, but in her heart, she was a great person, an awesome, beautiful person," end quote. He misses her every day. Well, March 2000, Rosemarie Felt was 32 years old and working Michigan Avenue, where she picked up her last John. Tall, chunky, the killer said that Rose had a deep voice. They drove up near the railroad tracks, where for $50 they had sex. And then she wasn't breathing. He dragged her out the passenger side, tossing her on the side of a hill, and left. Again, he went home and showered because he felt dirty. Well, why had he picked up Rose to begin with? Quote, "Because my wife doesn't have sex with me at home," end quote. And note that that is a cop-out. It's just an excuse. Rose's autopsy was performed by Dr. Yung Chung on April 11th and revealed she died from manual strangulation. Her stomach was empty, and she tested positive for alcohol and cocaine. And like Wendy, she was identified through fingerprints. Fellow prostitute Deborah remembers that Rose was homeless and was working out of hotels on Michigan Avenue. By this time, her daughter Jennifer, now 21, felt something was wrong when she didn't receive a birthday call from her mom that March, because her mother always called on holidays and birthdays and things like that. Scott, Rose's brother, carries the weight of regret. A few months before her murder, Rose had reached out asking to move in with him and his family. And while Scott wanted to help, his ex-wife was uncomfortable, so he had to refuse. He often wonders if accepting could have changed everything. Kelly Jean Hood was born February 1966 in Bay City and raised in Muskegon, and was the second oldest in her family. Known for her love of animals, her home was filled with stray dogs, cats, and various pets in inner-city Detroit. She left high school in her junior year, and her sister Shannon describes her as a free spirit. A hard worker, she started babysitting at 12 and later worked as a bartender and waitress. She moved to Detroit, the lure of the big city impossible to resist. Kelly loved to socialize and met her husband Tony through a mutual friend. They would have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Kelly was working as a hotel maid, and life was fairly normal. But then, like the other victims we've talked about, her life took a downward turn. Kelly became addicted to crack cocaine. Her son Kyle recalls that after his sister was born in 1994, his mother began using drugs, which eventually escalated to heroin. And this addiction strained the marriage, leaving Tony frustrated as he tried to manage the situation and help her. By 1997 or 1998, Kyle mentioned that Kelly had turned to prostitution to support her habit. Deborah, a family member, knew that Kelly was on the streets for 2 or 3 years. Like Rose and Wendy, Kelly experienced homelessness and danced in nearby clubs. Before Kelly's involvement with crack, she was focused on her kids and Tony. And this change was heartbreaking to her family, who felt helpless to intervene. In June 1999, Tony filed for divorce and gained custody of the children. Now, Kyle thinks back and remembers his mother as generous, saying, quote, "Even though she was using drugs heavily, she had a great heart," end quote. Seen by her mother-in-law on April 11th, 34-year-old Kelly Jean Hood had a black eye and was staying with a friend, Cheryl, who was also a prostitute. Just a week prior, Kelly had been hospitalized for pneumonia, but now she refused the family's offer of help to enter rehab. The killer would pick her up behind a gas station on Michigan Avenue around 11:15 p.m. Described as a brunette, white, weighing 120 to 130 pounds, which is 54 to 59 kilograms, she was wearing a black warm-up suit and a white shirt. He took her down by the railroad tracks, the same area where he had dumped previous victims. After negotiating sex, he strangled her, claiming he let go when he realized what he was doing. He insisted that Kelly was alive when he left her by the woods next to the tracks. Tony and the kids were living with his mom when she received a call about them finding Kelly's body. As she approached the dinner table, she delivered the heartbreaking news that Kelly was gone. Just 9 years old at the time, Kyle, who is the eldest, struggled to comprehend what had happened. Nevertheless, Kyle does have fond memories of spending time with his mom, while understanding that she was deeply addicted to the drugs. Nicole Young worked the streets of Detroit, particularly on Michigan Avenue, using the name Robin Brown. She would vanish at the age of 20. The specifics surrounding her alias are unclear, and the records using it are inconsistent. But it appears that she was born in January 1980, but even that is uncertain. What is known is that Nicole was a black woman, standing 5'3" or 1.6 meters tall, with a medium complexion, brown eyes, and brown hair. She also had a tattoo, Jason, on her left leg. Originally from Chicago, after a rape, Nicole became a ward of the state, who failed to prosecute her rapist. She had been arrested for prostitution twice, and she and her boyfriend decided to move to Detroit, where again she resorted to prostitution after he abandoned her. Well, family were notified that her body had been located, and none responded. And they didn't respond when B.R. Bates reached out to them for this book either. So it was the night of April 9th or early morning on April 10th, 2000, when Nicole Young, wearing 2 jackets, one black and one red, was picked up by the killer on Michigan Avenue. Once again, they drove to the railroad tracks. This is now the 3rd time. He was frustrated with Nicole as she mocked him over his small penis and told him he didn't know how to use it. He later told police that in a fit of rage, he strangled her. On this occasion, this stupid white boy, as he called himself, used a ligature, the very stockings that she was wearing. Initially, Nicole fought back, but he claimed his memory became hazy. He recalls that driving away, he saw her body in the rearview mirror. And mere hours later, her body was discovered. Dr. Chun again determined her cause of death to be ligature strangulation, with the white elastic nylons wrapped twice around her neck and secured in front by a half-square knot. Now that means that this act required thought, time, and effort. Several of her pearl-colored fake nails were missing, and on her autopsy report there is an addendum dated April 27th that confirms that her real name was Nicole Marie Young, age 17. And she would be the last known person ever killed by John Eric Armstrong. The victim list continues beyond the 5 women I've just mentioned. Months before they encountered the serial killer, Natasha Olniak, another Detroit woman, crossed his path. Unlike many prostitutes, Natasha was sober and worked the streets for extra cash. She lived in Grand Rapids with her 2 children and her mother, and she would commute the 2.5 hours to Detroit to work from a hotel on Michigan Avenue for a few days. After that, she and some friends would travel to New York City or Las Vegas before returning home. Her boyfriend was the pimp managing the other girls in Grand Rapids. Now, don't forget Natasha. The husband and wife were being duly discharged from the Navy. John Eric Armstrong, known as Eric, then moved to Detroit with his wife Katie and their baby son. He was nervous before meeting Natasha. This was his first encounter with a Detroit prostitute. 26-year-old Natasha was blonde, wearing a skirt and fur coat, which caught Eric's attention. After she got into his Jeep, she directed him to her hotel, noting that Eric seemed uncomfortable. After using the bathroom, he abruptly told her that he didn't feel right and needed to leave, claiming he forgot something in the car. Well, Natasha found his behavior really strange, thinking, quote, "I can't do this. I don't trust this," end quote. Returning to the hotel room, he told her not to forget her hat and asked if she needed a ride back, with her declining. He then left, but soon there was a knock at the door, and John, as he was calling himself, was back. When she opened the door, things took a turn for the worse. He had retrieved a knife from his Jeep. Eyes wide, Natasha insisted she hadn't done anything wrong, pleading with him not to kill her because she had kids. And he told her to shut up. Panicking, she backed away rapidly as he rushed at her, grabbing her by the throat, choking her. Wrestling, she was no match for this huge man, and he slashed her face and her head, causing Natasha to slip and fall, and the knife to fall out of his hand. Grabbing her, he slammed her back on the bed, grabbing the telephone cord, with her thinking, quote, "I'm gonna die." As he said, "I hate hookers," end quote. But Natasha played dead until she actually did pass out. When she awoke, the cord was very tightly wound around her neck, with her tongue protruding. John was gone. Unwinding the telephone cord, she ran from the room, telling the other girls about the assault. The front desk called the Dearborn police around 1 a.m. on August 15th. Officers Kenitra, McDonald, and Nicholwitz responded, noting the red marks around Natasha's neck, the bruising on the back of her head, and the lacerations on her hands. Taken to Oakwood Hospital, Natasha had to have the tips of 2 fingers stitched back on, plus additional stitches on her head. Her eldest son, Kenny, recalled seeing his mom, that her head was blood red with over 100 stitches. He told B.R. Bates that his mom couldn't bear to sleep in a bed for over 20 years due to this, feeling safer sleeping on the sofa. Officer Anthony Domick processed the hotel room for evidence, collecting a silver-toned belt buckle with initial, in capitals, inscribed on it. Natasha thought it had belonged to her attacker. She described him as a 25 to 26-year-old white male, about 220 pounds, muscular with a light complexion, eyeglasses, short hair, and mustache. Although he claimed to be from Oklahoma, she didn't believe him. The knife he used was 3.5 inches long, or 4 centimeters, and she told the detective that he drove a blue Jeep Wrangler. Well, a somewhat lackluster investigation began, consisted of taking photographs and bagging the belt buckle. And Natasha, with her bloodshot eyes and hoarse voice, felt that they weren't taking her seriously, especially when they started searching for a crack pipe, finding none. Remember, she was stone sober. She also realized that her attacker had stolen $500 from her. 4 days later, the detective alerted the Detroit Police Department's Sex Crimes Unit because Natasha had met this John outside Dearborn city limits. Well, several months after her attack, Natasha read in the Grand Rapids Press that John Eric Armstrong had been arrested for murder. Freaking out, she contacted the police, confirming that Armstrong was the man who had nearly killed her. Detective Sullivan had already looked at the reports and was making this connection, but had waited for her to reach out first. Natasha reflected on her experience and how pretending to be dead may have saved her life. And this attack affected her deeply. To this day, she avoids crowds and struggles with trust. Natasha spent years on medication for PTSD while raising her children. She now has 5 grandchildren who know the story about John Eric Armstrong. When a red-haired man was arrested for a gruesome murder in Grand Rapids in 2018, Natasha called B.R. Bates out of fear that Armstrong might be connected, and B.R. assured her that he would never, ever see the light of day again. Natasha Olnichak would testify against Armstrong in court, recalling his sinister presence. Quote, "He couldn't look at me. He turned his head and looked the other way." End quote. The ongoing investigation into John Eric Armstrong would reveal that there were 4 survivors of his assaults, rather than just one. The 3 additional survivors would testify at his trial, while police continued to ponder just how many others may be out there. With gaps in between attacks, it seemed unlikely that Armstrong had taken a pause in his attacks and murders. And then, long after his capture and trial and verdict and sentencing, a comment would appear in a blog post leading to a revelation that was shared in this book for the very first time. Enter Zelda Jacobowski, who looked at the falling snow and thought of Charlie Brown's snowflakes. She had just left her last client, who drove off in his Cadillac. The hotel she was at, while close to Michigan Avenue, was still in Verner, an area not yet revitalized by developmental projects. New to prostitution, Zelda had recently quit her job due to her drug habit. Zelda was a bit of a miracle herself. When pregnant with Zelda, her mother was advised against having the baby because she was battling uterine cancer, but she chose to have her baby anyway. Growing up, Zelda faced limited opportunities, and like her mom, often landed dead-end jobs, eventually turning to drugs to cope. By the time Zelda's son was born, her self-esteem was low, leaving her feeling unworthy of motherhood. She later reflected on this time as one of, quote, running and medicating, end quote, trying to escape her pain, emotional and physical. Now, the winter of 1999 was particularly cold in Detroit, with the first snowfall occurring in early December. A series of events began shortly after that, although the exact time is unclear since Zelda never filed a police report, but it appears to have happened a few days after Monica Johnson's murder. At this time, Zelda was feeling grateful because a kind-hearted person had given her a thick, warm coat. As she walked past the high school that Rose Felt and her boyfriend Alex had once attended, Zelda was not far from the railroad tracks, a known spot for meeting Johns, as we've seen. Zelda noticed a Jeep with a man inside who was watching her intently. Uncertain as to whether he was waiting for someone or looking for a date, their eyes locked and the unspoken communication between them confirmed that he was indeed looking for a hooker. Zelda proposed her price, and to her surprise, it was accepted without hesitation. She noted that he was a large man with reddish hair and freckles. Quote, "He looked like apple pie, the nicest guy you could ever meet, unassuming and disarming," end quote. With her mind racing ahead, she calculated that she'd make some extra cash and be home by 10 p.m. He had a pack of Newport 100 cigarettes, which she noted because she also liked Newports. A little music was playing in the background, as the sound of the door locks clicking gave Zelda a jolt. But she reassured herself that these were just the new automatic features cars had now. She drifted off into her own thoughts, and he suddenly slammed on the brakes and yanked a large knife with a wood handle from under his seat. Zelda was too shocked to feel scared as the large man moved fast, stabbing her in the side of her stomach, with the thick, warm coat preventing the knife from penetrating. Uh-oh. Zelda thought, this guy's military, but she sensed that the Lord was preserving her life. Their eyes locked again as he lunged, but the coat held firm. Just as he attempted the third strike, she began to snap out of the shock, fighting back, even gripping the blade of the knife herself, as he demanded, quote, "Let go of the blade," end quote. "Unlock the door," she replied, and the stalemate was on. His face was fiery red, but she didn't let go. "Open the door," she repeated as he hit her, trying to pull her hair, but she held on to that knife knowing if she let go, she would die. Wiggling closer to the passenger door, he finally popped the lock, with her opening it and sliding out. Blood was splattered all over the inside of the Jeep, including the windshield, her DNA everywhere, as the tip of her pinky dangled. Oh my God. During her conversation with B.R. Bates, Zelda showed her the scar on the finger from the stitches. After her visit to the hospital, she would walk back home still reeling in shock from what had happened, never mentioning the attack that night. She recalled how the man's expression shifted from casual to terrifying in a flash when he attacked her, describing him as looking possessed. Over time, she realized that he had been stalking her, sizing her up, and planned out what he intended to do as he watched her on the street. Years later, after marrying, Zelda told her husband about the attack. He, in turn, shared her story with his best friend, Don, who ran a ministry for Detroit's prostitutes. He also was conducting an informal sociological study by recording their experiences. Initially hesitant, Zelda eventually spoke about her ordeal, and when she finished, Don showed her a photo from the newspaper asking if this was the guy, and Zelda gasped. It was Mr. Apple Pie, also known as the convicted killer, John Eric Armstrong. She had totally missed the news about his arrest. Zelda has now recovered from addiction and is still happily married, and she has dedicated herself to helping girls in need who seek to break the harmful cycles so evident in her community. With God's help, she has also forgiven her attacker, and as always, I am amazed by the human capacity to forgive. I am very much a work in progress. So, our killer. Growing up in New Bern, North Carolina, Eric had distanced himself from his biological father, John, who abandoned the family when Eric was 5. Later, Eric would say he had been abusive. In 1984, Eric's mother, Linda, remarried, and Eric gained step-siblings and started calling his stepfather Dad. Following high school, Eric enlisted in the Navy and served aboard the USS Nimitz, where he would meet his wife, Katie. They married in 1989 and were discharged in the spring of 1999, after they welcomed their first son. Settling in Dearborn Heights, they moved in with his in-laws, and Eric took a job as a security guard, but soon left to go work at Target. He would later begin refueling aircraft at Detroit Metro Airport. Meanwhile, Katie was attending Schoolcraft College and discovered she was expecting their second child. Now, at this time, Detroit had a reputation as the murder capital of the United States. Residents were aware of this, so that attempted murder of Natasha Olniak in August 1999 didn't shock many. Similarly, Monica Johnson's murder in December of that year largely went unnoticed, and the killer continued to act without consequence. However, everything changed with the murder of Wendy Johnson in early 2000. Eric Armstrong made a critical mistake as his life began to unravel because he came to the radar of not just one, but 2 police departments, Detroit and Dearborn Heights. This is because he reported to the police that he had seen the body of the person he killed floating in the Rouge River. Sergeant Mike Petrie from the Dearborn Heights Police Department suspected that Armstrong was trying to get ahead of the situation. And I think that's true, and that Armstrong also craved attention, the thrill of discovery, and the excitement of knowing that this crime was his, a twisted sense of being a hero by reporting it, a good Samaritan. Unfortunately for him, this backfired spectacularly, and to make matters worse, he had crossed from Detroit into another municipality, leaving his victim in the suburb, very close to where he lived, which ensnared him in his own web of manipulations. Leaving Target at about 4:30 p.m., he got into his bluish-gray Jeep Wrangler and drove towards his in-laws' house. He stopped at the bridge from where he had dumped Wendy Johnson's body in the wee hours of that morning. The concrete bridge had a sidewalk and guardrails around it that extended out by several yards. As he stood on the bridge and looked over the south side, Sarah Darrows and her boyfriend, Alan Berry, noticed him lingering. They initially dismissed his presence and they got in their car, driving off. However, as they drove near the bridge, Armstrong jumped in front of their car and urged them to call 911, claiming there was a, quote, dead prostitute, end quote, in the water. Alan would park in front of Armstrong's Jeep, and he saw Wendy's body in the partially frozen river and asked Sarah to call his dad, Thomas Berry, who happened to be a police officer, as Alan was calling 911 to report the body. When Thomas Berry arrived at the scene, he took the phone from Alan, finishing the call and waiting for the police to arrive. The older Berry kept an eye on Armstrong. After all, he was the one who had noticed the body. Seeing Thomas Berry watching him, Armstrong walked away slightly, pretending to dry heave. And the suspicious police officer in Berry suspected that Armstrong's display was all an act. Armstrong claimed that he was visiting a girlfriend and feeling sick, he had found the body when he stopped to vomit. And I'm sure that Eric thought that this would be the end of his involvement, but he was mistaken. Dearborn Heights police officers arrived at 4:52 p.m. as darkness was settling in. They saw the body lying in the frozen river, with one of her gold pumps nearby, along with a cosmetic bag and a bra. Evidence technicians and the Wayne County Marine Division dive team arrived to recover Wendy's body, carefully covering her hands to preserve any evidence. All items found in proximity to Wendy, including the gold shoe, hairs found on her tights, skirt, and face, were all processed. Given that her black leather skirt was around her ankles, a rape kit was conducted, and swabs were sent in for DNA testing. It certainly wasn't a suicide because you don't pull your skirt down before you go and try to kill yourself jumping off a bridge. The police began questioning witnesses, gathering their names and addresses. And Armstrong repeated his story, saying he was driving home from work when he suddenly felt sick, prompting him to pull over. Peering over the railing, he had spotted the body, with Detective Sergeant Robert Stevens and Sergeant Mike Petrie listening to him, but realized, quote, there seemed to be a flaw in the slaw, end quote. Back at the station, Detective Lieutenant Gary Tomkiewicz, head of the Major Crimes Division in Dearborn Heights, was listening as new information came in, and he too had a feeling that something was off. This guy had seen the body leaning over the bridge to vomit, but Tomkiewicz couldn't help wonder how a person could manage that when the cement casing on the viaduct was at least 2.5 to 3 feet, or almost a meter, wide. Tomkiewicz thought, quote, what was this guy, a contortionist or something? End quote. And it raised another question as well. Why would this guy stop there when he was so close to home? The story just didn't add up. During a background check, Tomkiewicz found an incident from November 1999, reported by the Novi Police Department. John Eric Armstrong, then a security guard at Detroit Medical Center, had staged a break-in, breaking a window and cutting himself with a scalpel, claiming he fought off a burglar. While he later admitted to fabricating the whole story, resulting in charges in Oakland County. Evidence also indicated that Armstrong attempted suicide after this incident. He had left a note for his wife referencing his personal Jeep license plate, Baby Doll, along with his keys and his wedding ring. He overdosed on medication at home, and his stomach had to be pumped. Well, Tomkiewicz was intent on bringing this guy in for questioning. The police searched the Baby Doll Jeep, which was purchased recently in 1998, and it was in disarray, filled with candy wrappers, crumbs, scattered clothes, a blue nylon gym bag, and condom wrappers. Well, I always kept my condom wrappers in my car. That's weird. Detective Mike Petrie, the lead investigator, thought that the victim might be a prostitute and maybe a civic-minding upstander may have reported her body. But then he noticed that Armstrong, despite feeling nauseous and stopping, hadn't vomited and was literally 2 blocks from home. Petrie also knew that the victim had worn gold shoes with flecks, and similar gold flecks were found in Armstrong's car, with Petrie going on high alert. At the station, Petrie suspected Armstrong was somehow involved in this. He wondered if Armstrong had picked up a prostitute who died in his car, maybe from an overdose, and if he had dumped the body to hide what happened from his wife. At 7:09 p.m., Armstrong gave his statement to Detective Petrie, with Sergeant James Sorotowski present as well. And Armstrong, initially soft-spoken, grew increasingly agitated. It was clear to Petrie that he was withholding information. Armstrong said again that he felt ill at work and he regretted eating nachos, which had upset his stomach. He left work around 4:30 p.m., and having never seen a dead body before, was visibly shaken. And the officer expressed sympathy, saying, quote, "I'm sorry you had to become involved in a situation like this," end quote. However, Armstrong wasn't willing to divulge any more information, and they lacked sufficient evidence to confront him about the murder of a woman. They did bring up the fake Novi burglary incident, which Armstrong claimed had actually occurred, and he said the police hadn't believed him, so he told them what they wanted to hear. He had attempted suicide, fearing that he was actually a felon, but had received counseling and was still in treatment. Now, Don Riley, who was leading the Wendy Jordan investigation, sensed Armstrong was lying, and he also noted the absence of vomit. Calling the Novi Police Department, they later confirmed to Riley that Armstrong was a liar and likely deceiving them as well. As the interview continued, Armstrong felt increasingly uneasy with the personal questions, especially those about his wife. He became defensive when Petrie mentioned that a team of investigators were looking for DNA evidence. Armstrong insisted that they would not find anything linking him to the woman and expressed a desire to go home. Sorotowski suggested that while Armstrong may not be involved, perhaps he knew someone who could be, with Armstrong stating he just moved here and had no friends in the area. When they asked him about the condom wrapper found in the car, he explained his wife didn't want to get pregnant, so he had bought condoms, but had never used one before, so he had tried them out at work after picking them up at the mobile station on Warren Avenue. He wanted to try them out at work. He's trying condoms out. Give me a freaking break here. But this was another clue. That mobile station on Warren was in the hood. What was a boy from Dearborn Heights, new to town, doing there with condoms on his mind? Well, after getting off work around 10:30 p.m., Eric said he couldn't sleep, and he drove around, returning home around midnight. He said that his wife wanted him to drive around and get lost to figure out how to find his way back home, which, honestly, I laughed out loud. This is just ridiculous. So Petrie left the room, leaving Sorotowski there to comfort a visibly emotional John Eric Armstrong, whose wife, by the way, was returning home that evening from a trip to Ohio. Now, unbeknownst to him, Detective Sergeant Stevens had already been to the home of Armstrong's in-laws and left his card there because they were out. They got home, found the card, and they called Stevens back, which led him to visit Katie's mother, Diane. The Armstrongs then sent family friend and attorney Thomas Cardinal to the police station, where he actually approved a vehicle search. And after several hours of interrogation, Armstrong was released, and he and Katie went to visit the bridge where all of this went down later on. Detective Petrie wished he had more information because he felt that Armstrong was really close to confessing, and I opened with Petrie's comments on this, that Armstrong never denied killing her, which is what most innocent people will do. The Jeep was impounded and towed to a lot where it was photographed, fingerprinted, tape lifted, searched, and the Michigan State Police would process this evidence. Investigators found more condom wrappers with fur or fibers, a pocket knife, a box cutter, 2 earrings, a button from women's clothing, along with a note from his therapist indicating that Armstrong was receiving care. The police spoke to the mobile gas station clerk, who told them they only sold Trojan condoms, while the wrapper in Armstrong's Jeep was from Lifestyle's brand. Haha. Removing the body from the river proved surprisingly easy, and luckily her legs were lifted up, being caught on an ice jam, which preserved the semen within. Now, police also delved into where Wendy Jordan had been and where she hung out. Employees confirmed seeing Wendy in the area and had been working there the last few years. At a nearby Sunoco station, a worker recalled seeing her around 4:30 a.m. Additionally, a man reported seeing Armstrong near Chick's Bar, and neighbors living next to Armstrong's in-laws reported hearing a car leave their driveway around 5 a.m. So the next day, January 3rd, the autopsy of Wendy Jordan came back with strangulation her cause of death. The rape kit was being processed, her clothing was dried out and hair collected from it, and her fingerprints would give her her name back. But no other usable fingerprints were found. Police now worked with the attorney, Cardinal, to arrange a polygraph test and draw blood for Armstrong, who was cooperating. The polygraph, administered by Westland investigator David Heater, revealed that Armstrong was likely being deceitful about his story of buying condoms at the mobile station and masturbating on break at Target, and discovering the body because he was going to vomit. At Garden City Hospital, Sergeant Riley collected a blood sample and hair samples from Armstrong, which proved to be more difficult than anyone anticipated because Eric was completely shaved, likely with barber clippers. Armstrong said his wife preferred him that way, but they managed to take a hair from his scrotum. Now, these samples were sent to Michigan State Police Lab 2, but this is in the year 2000, and DNA analysis technology is limited compared to what we have today. So the results would take months. I kid you not. And the hurry up and wait phase of the investigation began for the investigators. And for you too, because in 2 weeks, I will return with part 2 of the baby doll serial killer, the John Eric Armstrong homicides. And this is where it gets intense. No, it's not intense yet. We're just getting into the investigation. Make sure you subscribe so you do not miss a thing. And I want to announce our next book, 16 Minutes. Was the Death of Baby Matthew an Accident or Murder? By Diane Marger Moore. On March 6, 1993, a fire broke out in a nursery in Indianapolis, Indiana. 16 minutes later, firefighters extinguished the blaze, revealing a room so severely burned that everything was unrecognizable. Firefighters were then told to look for a newborn baby boy. Only 2 people were at home when the fire erupted, and that would be Matthew's parents. Fire investigators deemed the incident suspicious, and while an initial prosecutor was uninterested in pursuing the case, the new arson prosecutor, Diane Marger Moore, our author, was determined to seek justice for baby Matthew Wise. I appreciate you joining me on this journey through the best true crime books, and if you enjoy the podcast, please share it and leave a positive review. I would love to hear your thoughts on any of our books and cases at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com or connect with me on X, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. You can also join my Patreon for $4 a month to help me choose the next book I'll feature. I see you as you hear me. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.